Sprawled between sun-kissed farmland and spectacular hills in Camarillo, California, sits the beautiful campus of California State University, Channel Islands, where we are reimagining higher education for a new generation and era. Our mission is rooted in the belief that higher education transforms lives and the advancement of knowledge enhances the common good. Cal State Channel Islands provides an exceptional higher education experience to students from Ventura, Santa Barbara, and the LA Basin. Many of our students come from underserved populations and are the first in their families to attend college. A majority receive financial assistance. Our faculty and staff are united in the belief that an educated populace serves as the fundamental bedrock of our democracy and the surest path to a brighter future for us all. Our students receive a hands-on education that instills in them the critical thinking, problem-solving, communication, and mathematical skills they will need to thrive in today's innovation economy. They are engaged citizens who are more likely to vote, volunteer, and participate in their communities and our democracy. Our graduates are the nurses, teachers, healthcare providers, and leaders critical to the success of our region, and every degree we confer is a return on the investment into the strength and vitality of our community.
Good morning, and welcome to From Change, Opportunity, a webinar series brought to you by the CSUCI Foundation that highlights CI's continued efforts to reimagine higher education for a new generation and era. My name is Neil Kreisel, and I'm a friend of the university and radio show host at AM 1290 KZSB. Provost Dr. Mitch Avila will join us shortly. Before we jump into our discussion, how academic excellence can shape our future, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping items. Please be aware that we are recording today's event. This and all webinar recordings are listed on CSUCI's website. I'd like to also draw your attention to the bottom of your screen. If you wave your mouse near the bottom, you will notice a menu bar pop up containing a chat button. During the presentation, if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box. There may not be time to answer every question, but staff will capture the unanswered questions and follow up in the next few days. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mitch Avila, CSU Channel Islands Provost. Good morning, Dr. Avila, and welcome not only to the webinar, but to the CSUCI family.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and it's great to be a part of Channel Islands. Right, it's a fabulous campus, and I've only had the opportunity to be on campus for a couple of times since I've started, but that's changing rapidly. So I'm looking forward to connecting with all the folks at this campus.
So we're thrilled to have you as the provost, and I'm going to ask a question that I bet some of the people in the audience would like to ask but are afraid to ask, and that is, what is a provost?
Yeah, so a provost is the chief academic officer. In many ways, that's the highest ranking faculty member, right? So the primary qualification is you have to come up through the faculty ranks. One way of thinking about the role is that what does the scope of work include? That includes, hiring, promoting, evaluating faculty, curriculum, accreditation, scheduling classes, grades, transcripts, pretty much everything related to teaching courses and offering degrees, right? So all that academic work. In practice, a lot of what a provost does is manage managers. And by that, I mean, I deal a lot with directly with the deans and various associate vice presidents that report to me. And so my goal really is, as a provost, is to promote the good work that those managers are doing and help them to perform at a high level. But it's all about the academic enterprise.
So the webinar today is called How Academic Excellence Can Shape Our Future. But how do you define academic excellence?
Well, so one of the mistakes I think we make when we think about defining academic excellence is we go naturally to the outliers, right? And the outliers are, some very high profile universities. So for example, the Harvard, MITs, Yales, Stanfords of the world, right? In those universities, right, we look to them as models, but in fact, they're not really a model of what higher education has, right? Most of the work of higher education is happening in state-run public institutions like Channel Islands, like the campuses of the CSU. So once you start your thought from there, right? You start your thought from, what universities are actually doing in terms of the work that's happening there, then some of your criteria for academic excellence shifts as well, right? So we're talking about transformative experiences that impact the lives of students. We're talking about moving students up in terms of income quintiles, right? So we evaluate our mission not on, how many students applied and how many did we turn away, right? But instead, how many did we graduate, right? How many first generation students did we graduate? How much debt do they have after they've graduated? How much do they earn over the course of their lifetime, right? So just take a simple basic fact like transfer students. The elite institutions of the world typically don't have students come in as transfer students, but an institution like Channel Islands is serving transfer students as one of our main groups of people that we serve. So, when we evaluate academic excellence at Channel Islands, we're really looking to things like the Social Mobility Index, the best colleges for transfers, student lists, right? Lists of most transformative colleges. That's how we really evaluate our impact and what academic excellence means.
So could you tell us a little bit about your story and how that has informed your view of what academic excellence is? So, where are you from? Did you have, super rich parents and went to the best prep school in England, or did you have to struggle?
Yes, well, I think we all struggle at some point, but super rich parents, no, I wouldn't say that, right? So let me just say that I'm starting my 27th year in the CSU, and I couldn't be happier to be here. And so a lot of my story is really about having sort of come to the CSU, and why that's important for what I bring as a role as a provost. So my family background, right? The Avalas are from Southern Monterey County. We've been there since the mid-19th century. If you know anything about California history, it was a very different place at that time. The Avalas were ranchers, vaqueros, right? Folks who were working the land, working with, horses and cattle, right? That kind of lifestyle. So it was all very working class. Things changed over time, right? I grew up in Monterey County, and through good luck and fortune, I did my graduate work just up the road from Channel Islands at UC Santa Barbara. So there's a story, I think, that's related to Santa Barbara and coming to the CSU that says a lot about what I bring to the provost role and a lot of my philosophy here. When I was in graduate school, I was studying philosophy, and I really wondered if maybe I'd made a mistake, right? And like, wow, I thought I was going to do something important and have an impact on the world. And when I was leaving grad school, I just couldn't see what it was going to be, right? We had a faculty member at our institution who was proud of saying, well, we're not curing cancer here, by which he meant that the philosophy wasn't having much of an impact. So I found myself my first year after completing my doctorate at Fresno State. Early on in that first semester, students started to say, wow, I've never been asked to think like this before, right? And this is a really interesting class. You're really challenging me to ask questions that I haven't asked before. After that first year, I went home, redid my classes from top to bottom, thought completely differently about how I approached my courses. And in particular, what I learned to do was to start my thought and start the teaching from the lives of students, right? This became something that was a cornerstone of my teaching career and also my research. Think about problems from the margins, think about problems from the point of view of the worst off, right? Start your thought not from your discipline, but from the lives of our students. And so I've used that throughout my teaching career. And it's also what I do as an administrator, right? I think about, let's imagine this institution from the margins, right? From those that we serve. Let's start our thought from the lives of the students in the region, right? As opposed to starting our thought from some comparison to some model of an elite institution, which we're never going to be, in which we really have a very different mission to begin with.
When you look at the press every year, they talk about the amount of money the graduate of that institution makes, and there's been a drop off in humanities majors. And telling your story made me think that philosophy may in fact be a very important skill even in business, because it makes you able to think about things that emotionally intelligent people think about, and to think about how the world actually works. So in a sense, humanities and philosophy and art really is an important part of what makes education excellence. And I think
so Neil, that's really critical, because it's helpful for our students to understand that. So one of the things that I've always told students is take a wide variety of classes your first year and major in the class that you love the most, right? And we'll worry about your career at the end. So I had some experiences with students sending them on internships, and particularly philosophy majors. So these philosophy majors, they would go on internships to Washington, D.C. and work in a congressional office or in a federal agency. Before they went, they loved philosophy, they knew what skills they were learning and so forth, but they didn't know that it was valuable, or they would have an impact on the world, right? Or that, they could do meaningful work. That was hard for them to see. So they would come back after having spent the summer or the spring semester in DC, and they'd come back and they'd just be floating on air, right? They'd be so excited. And I'd say, well, how was your experience? And they're just like, it was amazing, right? And what they would narrate was that they realized that the skills that they were learning in these humanities courses were really applicable to the real world, right? They were about evaluating information. They were about communicating clearly, right? It was about, bringing a critical mind to things, logic and problem solving, right? All those are skills that are in high demand. There are very few students who actually end up in a career that matches their degree, right? So what degrees do is channel their energies and their focus, their thoughts, and help them be an expert in an area. But all those skills are really meant to be expanded and applied to a wide variety of career opportunities. And since we know that most people, the predictions are that most graduates these days will actually have multiple careers, right? In multiple, they need to be flexible there. And so that humanities provide that kind of flexibility.
So when you taught, what are the courses that you taught?
So I would teach half a dozen courses, right? But so one of the classes I taught a lot was Introduction to Philosophy through Film. And in this class, we would start off actually by watching Triumph of the Will, and then we would compare that with 12 Angry Men. We watched Vertigo, Rashomon, High Noon. This was the sort of core philosophy component, right? A bit of Woody, Crimes and Misdemeanors, right, thrown in there. So it was a class about illustrating philosophical topics in film, and it's one of my favorite courses to have taught. I also would teach regularly a class on the philosophy of sex and love. And it's an interesting course because, when I was a faculty member, I was trying to drive students to take classes in philosophy. So we created a class, and we knew that the title would attract students. And then when I started teaching it, it became apparent that there was a real need, right? I mean, students had this kind of hole in their life of rationality where they weren't fully, thinking through problems when it came to love and sexuality and relationships, right? That area of their life was still full of magical thinking. And so it was a class where we help people work through that, but also, one of our stated goals was we want you to be able to graduate from this class, right, or take this course and be able to have a difficult conversation on these topics in a public setting and not be crass and not giggle your way through it, right? So we want to have adult conversations about these topics. The class I love to teach the most was philosophy of law. I just love that topic. I just love thinking through the conceptual issues there, and it was the one that I was enjoyed teaching most often.
Given the atomization of society that we see today, where we have a split in this country, I would imagine if more and more students took philosophy, we may have the basis for getting back together. That's just my view.
Yeah, no, I'd like to think that, right? I'd like to think that part of what we're doing in classes like that is helping people to deal with what philosophers call reasonable pluralism, right? So it's a problem of fundamental disagreement on things, but needing to be able to still have conversations. So when I would do the philosophy of sex and love course, right, I would start the class off by sharing with students and say, let's just think about the rest of the semester. Is someone going to say something in this class that's going to push your button? You bet. Right? You're going to at some point, you're going to be uncomfortable with the conversation. You're going to react emotionally to what's happening. And when that happens, I want you to remember that we're having this conversation now, and think about that one of the purposes of the class is, what do you do when that happens, right? How do we respond and still maintain that civil discourse, right? Another part of it, and I think this is key at Channel Islands as well, is we should never underestimate the importance of experience, right? And experience is our best teacher. Having students go on study abroad, having them do internships, having them do be involved in student research, right? This is really the place where students mature and grow and become citizens, right? So you want to do that in the context of reading, about, whether it's Plato or Locke or, some more recent works, right? You want that intellectual atmosphere for students to be processing those kinds of their experiences, right? And understand where they are in relationship to the world. So studying abroad is a great example of that. Various kinds of industry internships are also great examples of that. But anything that connects students to actually doing things, I think, is a very powerful tool.
So, given the resistance of some to the woke society and the pushback some professors are getting for saying things in an academic setting that upsets a student and that creates a crescendo of accusations. Could you teach that course today? And if people got upset about it, would that be a problem for you?
So what I found, and when faculty come to me and say, how do I deal with this problem in my class, right? I'm going to talk about issues that are, difficult, that, the students will be sensitive to, right? And so forth, right? Well, I've found that the primary tool that you can use and that's very effective is simply to name that early on at the beginning of the semester, right? And just identify that that's going to happen. And you don't need to do it like a warning before a difficult lecture. But you can say, to students, over the course of this semester, you're going to be offended, right? There are things that are going to be difficult for us to deal with. You need to anticipate that now and start anticipating how you're going to respond when that occurs. So yeah, I do think we could do that. One of the most difficult classes that I would ever teach would be one on sexual violence. And what I knew and what I could see happening in those close classes was there were students in the course who had been victims of sexual violence. It was difficult for them to have that conversation. But part of what my role was to model how we could talk about this in a setting, right? And have spaces and have a genuine conversation, right? And not just fall back into a kind of reactive, a kind of very reactive way of approaching the problem, right? So yeah, I do think it's possible, Neil, right? And I think that's what the university is about.
So how is your, I guess it's maybe too early to tell, but what is your outlook for hiring new professors?
Well, so first of all, I think that's one of the most important things that we do, right? So one of the most important things we do is hire new faculty. And the reason is because we bring people in who last 20, 30, 40 years, right? We're talking decades of work on the campus, right? I know faculty who've been in the CSU system for over 40 years, right? So it's one of the most important decisions we make. So in terms of so one of my highest priorities as provost is actually to promote faculty hiring. So it's one of the #1 jobs. In terms of our ability to do that, it really depends on discipline. So some disciplines are harder to hire in and some are not. So nursing, for example, accounting and so forth, there's a lot of demand, particularly when there's demand in the industry. It's hard to bring people into the university because salaries aren't necessarily competitive. In the humanities, in arts, and economics, for example, it's a buyer's market, right? And my experience has been, this is my 4th CSU campus. My experience has been that in California in particular, we can hire away folks from mid-career from across the country. People want to come to Southern California. They want to come to the South Central Coast. It's a beautiful place to live. The quality of life is high. And, even people who are in tenure track jobs or are already tenured are interested to come into a place like Channel Islands. So it depends a little bit on the discipline, but I'm pretty bullish on this, right? I really think that there's a lot of opportunity and there are some great people out there, right? Just some amazing faculty who are looking to come to a place like Channel Islands.
What happens when a prospect looks at the housing costs? Does that create a problem for us?
Yeah, so I think I noticed, that CI is halfway between Montecito and Malibu, right? So there are some challenges in terms of housing. I've never found it to be an obstacle, right? And I've been hiring faculty for a lot of years, been involved in a lot of faculty searches. Most people seem to be willing to make that jump. They recognize the value. They recognize that, even though housing prices are higher, they're getting something back in return. And so it's not actually the obstacle to hiring faculty.
So speaking of hiring, we ought to let our audience know what a rigorous process your job search resulted in for our benefit getting you, but it certainly wasn't easy, was it?
No, it was grueling, in fact. And from my point of view, it's like I've told a number of people, I don't ever want to apply for another job again, right? This is it, right? I don't want to go through that experience again. It lasted quite a while. Started in the spring. There were some things that happened in the summer, and an almost 2-day Zoom interview. I sat in this same office, did interviews, from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. right? Met with the cabinet, right? Had follow-up meetings and so forth, right? It was actually a lot of work. On the other hand, it was good, right? I learned about the campus. I learned about the people there and the challenges. And then one of the things I thought was important was I came away from that process believing that I had a lot to contribute and that I had the right skill set to help lead the campus forward.
And the really tough part of the job is made clear by the fact that the average life of a provost in that job is 3 to 5 years. And given the fact that it takes about 5 years to accomplish anything, that really is a problem.
Yeah, no, it's true. Nationally, when you look at provost positions, they're typically about 3 years is about how long folks last. I've known provosts who haven't even made it 6 months in the role. Um, there are lots of reasons for the number. One reason is that a lot of people who step into these roles are just interns. It was going to be short to begin with. Many people are approaching retirement, so they're always sort of never was planning it to be a long-term gig. The other thing is that a lot of folks who are good as provosts move up into presidencies, and they're actively recruited early on in their career, right? So my hope is this is my last job, right? I'm hoping to retire from Channel Islands as provost, and I'm hoping that's going to last a few more years. I'm not ready to retire just yet. So,
Well, things should be better this year. COVID really changed the whole paradigm for our university and for schools across the country. Um, are we ready for this next step to come out of COVID?
yeah, we are. So the campus has been spending a lot of time planning on this, and cabinet has been working, and we're starting to roll out our plans for the fall semester. We're really looking to vaccines as being one of the key elements of this. And, my message to faculty, students, and staff is the number one thing you can do to support the institution turning safely in the fall is to be vaccinated, right? And so we're planning for 75% of our seats, what we call duplicate headcount, to be in face-to-face courses in the fall semester. Many of our students, if not all of our students, will be on campus at some point, right? We're particularly interested in bringing back our entering freshman students and our continuing freshmen to give them that experience of being on campus. It's part of their social emotional learning. It's part of what we do as a campus. So it's a challenge. But the importance of the work at Channel Islands, the importance of what we do, it really does require that we step into this difficult space and be present and ready for the fall semester. So I'm very hopeful about it.
Given the hybrid nature of the reintroduction of students, I imagine the peer mentorship program is going to be even more important today, helping students who may be unable to do everything on campus they need to do to become familiar with all the things they need to become familiar with.
Yeah, so it's been one of the areas where Channel Islands has seen a lot of progress and has a real success record, right? Is with embedded peer tutors or embedded peer mentors, right? These are peer-to-peer students who talk about some of the challenges in a particular class, but also are really just, I think, particularly coming back, what is it like to be on campus, right? What is your social life look like, right? We don't know what that's going to look like by August, right? But we're pretty confident of what that's going to look like by the end of the fall semester, and we're expecting really nothing to change until we get to by the spring semester. We'll be back fully face to face, and it's important for our students, right? It's important for them to have those experiences, particularly for students who are living in the dorms, right? I think you can evaluate a university based on how many coffee outlets it has, right? The quality of the food for students, right? All those things that student clubs and so forth. All of that part of the university is a critical part of what we do, and that aspect is really challenged in a virtual environment.
Has enrollment been suffered because of COVID, or how are our numbers right now?
So our anticipated numbers for fall semester, our admissions numbers are tracking ahead of where we had anticipated, right? So our application numbers were down a bit, but our yield, the interest from students is actually, in front of where it was last year. So we're pretty optimistic about that. We're expecting more or less flat enrollment. One of the things that we observed that we were concerned about and that we'll be doing our best to address is the drop off between fall and spring. We did lose some students in the virtual environment, And we'll be doing some targeted outreach to those students, see if we can bring them back to campus and reintegrate them into the life of the university.
Well, thank you, Dr. Avilar. And I'd now like to welcome questions from the audience. And the first question we have from an anonymous attendee is, as a new provost, what are your priorities that you are working on in your first year?
So a number of things that are come up as sort of critical priorities. So one of them is enrollment management, right? And so one of my goals over the next 5 to 7 years is to grow our overall student enrollment. I'd like to see that increase by 50% or that's aspirational, but I think we need to plan for that. So that's part of the initial goals. Another initial goal is we're working on realigning some of the positions in the division. So this is where we have a number of positions that over time have, maybe not coordinated as well with each other as they could have. So we're working to coordinate all of those positions in the division so that they work seamlessly together. Working on hiring and tenure track hiring, tying that to a budget and enrollment. That's also a critical first, initial priority, right? So you've heard me say, and many people have heard me say, it takes 5 years to get anything done, right? And so you really want to start that now, right? And so the kind of long-term planning that we need to do, we need to really get ahead of it very soon. The other big, project right looming on the horizon is our reaccreditation with WASC, and we'll in the fall kick off our accreditation efforts for the campus.
Next question picks up on something we were talking about before, and it's what does the future enrollment and growth of campus look like to you, and where does the local community and industry have a part in shaping that growth?
Right. So so one of the things that we need to do in order to grow as a campus is to expand our degree offerings and to offer a larger number of degrees that are appealing to students. And so I think that if we think about where we are as a campus, physically located, there's a lot of opportunities here, right? So some of those opportunities are, I just like to point out that Channel Islands is within driving distance of not one, but 2 spaceports, right? You've got Lompoc and you've got Palmdale, right? And in between that corridor is some of the most beautiful parts of California, but it's also a tech corridor, right? There's all kinds of innovation happening in that region. We're also, a short drive away from the cultural center, production center of the world, basically in Hollywood and in Burbank, right? So that's just right down the street from us. And we also have this amazing, resource in the Marine Sanctuary, the Channel Islands Marine Sanctuary. We just have this fabulous natural laboratory around the environment and caring, being engaged in nature. I would also point to, the future being associated with the green economy, right? With sustainability. All of our students need to come out of Channel Islands knowing how to do an carbon audit, right? Knowing how to reduce their carbon footprint, no matter what industry they're in. This is where the jobs are going to be in the future, and our students need to be prepared for that. So that's where I think that a lot of the growth is going to happen, and I think it's regional, but at the same time, I think it's the kind of place where we would see growth. All universities should be aiming to be in that same kind of space.
And this is a perfect question for a final question, and it is, what is your favorite thing about CSU Channel Islands so far?
So my favorite thing happened, I think in November, and I had the opportunity to go out to Santa Rosa Island. And it was absolutely fabulous. Part of what was fabulous about it was about midway through, we encountered a couple of humpback whales who enchanted the folks on the boat for 15, 20 minutes, bobbing up on either side. We saw, in super pod of dolphins, right? The multiple species, 2 species of whales, right? 2 species of dolphins. The marine life in the channel is absolutely amazing. They spent some time out on Santa Rosa Island. So I just really love that part of this. I love that commitment to the region. I love that commitment to experiential education. It's just the whole day was very exciting. And so I'm really glad that I had that opportunity. And I'd like to have all of our students have that opportunity to go out to Santa Rosa, experience that for themselves, and think through what it means to be here in this region and have this as a resource in our backyard.
We're at the end of our time. I'd like to thank Dr. Avila for speaking with us today and thank all of you for joining us. We value your feedback and invite you to participate in a short survey, which will pop up on your screen immediately after you exit the webinar. If you're interested in attending future webinars, the link to the webinar series has been placed in the chat box. The next installment of this series is on April 14th with Dr. Susan Andrzejewski as host, featuring Associate Professor of Marketing, Dr. Ekin Pillay, Van, and CI student Crystal Lopez, and Oxnard Downtown Management District Director Abel Magana. The topic is the Dolphin Dive, how CSU's CI's micro internships prepare students for a post-academic workforce. Once again, thank you for your time. We hope you can join us again in the future, and have a great day.